Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of the Leeds branch of the Jewish Historical Society of England and Milim to this evening's event. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And once again, we are pleased to welcome a truly international audience. We continue our series of joint events with David Gordon, who will be taking us on a tour of the long-lost Jewish communities of Northeast England. I will introduce David in just a moment. You are encouraged to ask questions. Please use the Q&A facility on your screen and type in your question, and we'll do our best to get through as many of your questions as possible once David has finished speaking. You can, of course, post the questions at any time you like during the evening. Please also be aware of the chat button, which allows you to send a message to the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. This presentation is being recorded and will be available in the coming days on our website, milim.org.uk. Please do visit this website to find out about future events, to book tickets, or to donate to support our work. And so to our speaker this evening. David Gordon was born in Sunderland in 1956 at a time when the Sunderland Jewish community was still in its pomp. He attended the newly established Menorah Primary School in Sunderland, and his family were members of the Sunderland Hebrew congregation in Ryhope Road, which he attended with his father every Shabbat and Yom Tov. His late grandfather, Isaac Gordon, his late father, Aubrey Gordon, a local solicitor and part-time judge, and his uncle, Julius Gordon, all played leading roles on the Shul Council in their time. His great-grandfather, Reb Chatzah Cohen, was one of the founders of the Beth HaMidrash synagogue in Sunderland, known as the Frum Shul, and he was responsible for bringing Rabbi Hurwitz from Lithuania to Sunderland to serve as rabbi of that congregation when it was established. His late uncle, Dr. Benny Gordon, was very active in the affairs of the Beth HaMidrash too. David will be looking at the history of the Jewish communities of Sunderland, North Shields, South Shields, Whitley Bay, Durham, Hartlepool, Stockton, Darlington, and Bishop Auckland. This promised to be a fascinating evening. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen, see where we get to. Right. Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan, for that very kind introduction. And thank you very much for inviting me to give this talk about the long-lost Jewish communities of Northeast England. Firstly, the scope of the talk. I'm not going to be speaking about the communities of Newcastle or Gateshead. Well, for one thing, they haven't disappeared. And for another, each of those communities deserves a talk of its own. Now, I'm also not going to be speaking about the Middlesbrough Jewish community. I simply couldn't do justice to that community in the time that's available. As for Sunderland, my own hometown, this was also a community which deserves a talk of its own, and I'll only have time really to deal with Sunderland in very broad outline. Instead, my talk is going to focus on what might be called the small, mostly vanished boutique communities of Northeast England, so North Shields, South Shields, Hartlepool, Darlington, which isn't quite a disappeared community, Stockton, Durham, Bishop Auckland, and Whitley Bay. So it's going to be quite a gallop, so buckle into your seats and let's get going. First of all, let's take a trip back 181 years, not to the northeast of England, but to Winschoten in Northeast Holland in 1839. This was home to a family of merchants and shipbrokers by the name of Lotinga, L-O-T-I-N-G-A. Between the 17th century and the middle of the 19th century, Holland declined as a world power. Britain replaced it as the maritime superpower of the age. Economic conditions in Holland were going downhill. On the 19th of April, 1839, the Treaty of London recognized Belgian independence from the Netherlands as a Catholic country to the south of Protestant Holland. Perhaps the two events are unconnected, but 7 months later, a Dutch Jewish shipbroker and merchant arrived by sea at the port of London with his family to start a new life in England. That new immigrant was Asa Moses Letinger. He arrived on the 21st of November, 1839. There's the certificate of arrival. But soon he moved 300 miles to the north, and he appears in the 1841 census, together with his wife and family, living in Sunderland. He was 36 years old, a merchant and shipbroker, and he had 4 young children. In the 1851 census, Asa Moses Letinger is recorded as being a general merchant, and he was living with his wife and his 5 children in High Street. In the old part of Sunderland, there's a road which runs steeply downhill, parallel to the River Wear, in sight of the sailing ships, which then, in those days, thronged what was a bustling port. 1851, the Jewish population of Sunderland was between 150 and 200 people. Sunderland was a thriving town. British prosperity was built on coal and ships, and Sunderland had both coal and ships, and also had maritime connections to London and the continent of Europe. The Letingers no doubt saw their opportunity to revive the family fortunes. The Letinger business empire was built on shipbroking. They chartered ships and they entered and cleared vessels at the customs house for a fee. Now, Jews had lived in Sunderland from about 1777 to actually one of the oldest, if not the oldest, Jewish community in northeast England. They met at various houses for religious services. There was the Polish community and what they called themselves the Israelite community. They were mostly Dutch and German, rather anglicized Jews. The Polish congregation was declining in numbers. By 1862, its religious appurtenances, so its Sefer Towers and so on, were acquired by the Sunderland Hebrew congregation, so-called. And the two congregations merged in 1857, actually more of a takeover in reality. And in 1858, the congregation made an appeal, published in the Jewish Chronicle, for funds to build a new synagogue. The building of the new synagogue began in summer of 1861, and it was consecrated in the spring of 1862. And at the laying of the foundation stone of what was called the Moore Street Synagogue, a silver trowel was presented to the man who promoted the synagogue project and donated much of the money which was required. And who was that? That man was Asa Moses Letinger, who we saw had arrived only 20 years earlier from Holland, and he became the first president of the Sunderland Hebrew congregation. The history of the Sunderland community reached a watershed in the 1880s following the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, that was in 1881. The anglicized Dutch German Jews were inundated with a very large migration of very observant and in every way foreign Jewish migrants from Lithuania. In Sunderland, a significant number of these new immigrants came from a single town. That was the town of Kretinga in Russian Lithuania. And they included my great-grandfather, Reb Chatzar Cohn, and most of his large tribe of 16 children and their offspring, and also the Perlmans, the Gillis family, the Olswangs, the Bermans, the Brouwers, the Bernsteins, and many others who formed the backbone of the Jewish community for the next 100 years or more. Now, if I haven't mentioned your family's name, please don't get upset. I'm afraid that's just inevitable in a short talk like this, and believe me, no offense is meant. The new immigrants were poor but devout. And they really rather revolted against what they regarded as the irreligious practices of the Sunderland Hebrew congregation. By 1888, there was a split between the Sunderland Hebrew congregation and the more orthodox Beth Medrash, or Bes Medrash, as it was always called in Sunderland. My great-grandfather, Reb Chatzar Cohen, being one of the founders of the Bes Medrash. The Bes Medrash had a synagogue of its own, first in Zion Street, appropriately enough, and then in Villiers Street. And in 1902, the Bes Medrash invited Rabbi Hirsch Hurwitz from Koshadar in Lithuania to be its rabbi, to replace Rabbi Bloch. His travel expenses of £5 were paid by the community, and his salary was fixed at £2 a week. It's about £250 a week in modern day values, and the community was stretching itself to pay that. Cementing the deal, Rabbi Hirsch Hurwitz's son, Alta, married one of Reb Chatzar Cohen's granddaughters, Dora. I mention this because Rabbi Hurwitz later took up an appointment in Leeds, my home for the past 36 years. And many will remember his son, Alta Max, and his children, Vivian, Marcia, and Enid, pillars of the community, the communities in Leeds, Bradford, and latterly in Netanya. The Sunderland Hebrew congregation and the Bes Medrash coexisted on friendly terms, each moving to new premises in the 1920s and 30s. Jews took leading roles in business, the professions, and in local politics. Many Jewish families prospered from furniture manufacture. There were many joiners and cabinet makers employed in the shipyards, even after they weren't building ships from wood. And the furniture manufacturing was really a spin-off from this. So Bernstein, Linskill, Davis, Gillis, Scher, these were all names associated with furniture manufacture in Sunderland. This small community, there was never more than maybe 1,500 Jewish people in Sunderland, punched above its weight. There were 2 shuls, 2 cheders, 2 kosher butchers, kosher deli. There was a kollel, a yeshiva, an old age home which served the whole of the northeast. There was the Chevra Kadisha, B'nai Akiva, Habonim, Jewish Cubs and Scouts. There was a Jewish primary school, which I went to, Jewish sporting teams, and the full range of Zionist and charitable organizations. Everything was run by volunteers, as it is in small communities. So Jack Cohen, Lady Kitty Cohen, and Charles Slater all served as mayors of Sunderland. Charles Slater, a great-grandson of Reb Chatzar Cohen, and so a cousin of mine, is credited with bringing the Nissan car factory to Sunderland in the 80s. So if you drive a Nissan, you're driving a Japanese Jewish car. The end came more quickly than anyone anticipated. The young people left town for education and employment opportunities, and few of them, including myself, ever returned. The Bes Medrash merged with the Sunderland Hebrew congregation in the mid-1980s, and 20 years later, it was March 2006, I know because I was there, the Ryop Road Synagogue closed its doors for the last time. The listed synagogue building, which is a very fine building, still stands as a monument to this vanished community, and the local population is left wondering what happened to our Jews, with whom it's right to say they enjoyed friendly relations. Sunderland rabbis have given distinguished service in other communities, of course, and on the London Beth Din, including Diane Ehrentrau, Diane Gelly, and the Sunderland Yeshiva actually continues to exist, just not in Sunderland, it's in Gateshead, where it retains its original name. Yeah. Now, Asa Moses Latinga, you remember the founder of the Moore Street Synagogue in Sunderland in the 1860s, actually had a number of grandchildren who were actors and entertainers in music hall and in films, notably Ernie Latinga. He was born in Sunderland in 1875, and I can see that his circumcision is recorded in the register kept by the Mohel, the authorized circumciser. Ernie Latinga, now largely forgotten, was a star of music hall and a successful film comedian of the early part of the 20th century, as well known then as, say, Sid James or Frankie Howard of the Carry On movies in the 1960s. He even toured with his siblings and their spouses in America and Australia. So the founding father of the first purpose-built synagogue in Sunderland, Asa Moses Latinga from Holland. He clearly sent positive reports back to Holland because in 1848, he was joined from Winschoten, the hometown of the Latingas, by his brother, Kalmar Solomon Latinga, and other members of the Latinga family. Kalmar arrived directly to Sunderland on the 8th of March 1848 with his wife and their 4 children. Their arrival is recorded in the Register of Alien Immigrants, which was maintained at the port of Sunderland in that year of Republican revolutions across Europe, which sent shivers through the British establishment of the time. But Kalmar Latinga, only 3 years after his arrival in Sunderland, can be found in the 1851 census living in North Shields. And that brings me to North Shields, a port at the mouth of the River Tyne on the north bank of the river. It's about 8 miles to the east of Newcastle and about 8 miles to the north of Sunderland. His occupation, Kalmar's occupation, was shipbroker and agent, and he'd obviously been tasked with opening a new branch of the Latinga family business in this bustling port on the Tyne. Yet another brother, Samuel Moses Latinga, also lived with his family in North Shields. The Jewish community in North Shields was established certainly no later than 1846. The local cemetery, which is at Preston, not that Preston, it's a suburb of North Shields, includes a railed off section with 57 Jewish graves. They include Latinga graves, and some of the other names are Cossack, Merkel, Marcus, Cohn, Jackson, Saltman, and Sheckman. Have I skipped a slide? Wait a moment. Yeah. In 1862, the Jewish Chronicle reported a visit to North Shields by the then chief rabbi, Dr. Adler. He inspected the Hebrew school, the Cheder, as chief rabbis do on these walkabouts. At first, the immigrants worshipped in private homes, but in about 1870, they rented a house in Linskill Street. It overlooks the mighty River Tyne from a height. I was there last week. The street still exists, but is now lined with executive housing. You couldn't afford it. By the year 1880, the community consisted of 15 to 20 families. The house at Linskill Street was renovated. The main hall upstairs consisted of an ark, a reader's desk in front of the ark, rows of polished wooden pews, and a gallery for the ladies separated by wooden railings. And the caretaker occupied the downstairs room. Many of the early Jewish residents of the town made their living from the sea, not surprisingly, sailors, outfitters, chandlers, and shipbrokers like the Latingas. The North Shields community never grew much because new immigrants to the town soon moved across the river to South Shields or to Newcastle inland, where there was a larger community and where suitable Jewish spouses could be ensnared for their eligible offspring. The Sharman family of North Shields, refugees from the Nazis, are an example of this migration from North Shields upstream to Newcastle upon Tyne. I believe their daughter is in my audience this evening. Hello, Dorothy. For many years, the North Shields congregation held services only on New Year and the Day of Atonement. The community never had a full-time teacher or shochet, ritual slaughterer of its own. In 1903, it was, for example, announced in the Jewish Chronicle that the Reverend Ehrenberg of Newcastle would conduct the New Year services. By the 1920s, the community was already past its peak. It was on the wane. In 1929, we read a letter, Esther Sheckman, secretary of the synagogue, she's writing to the Jewish Chronicle asking for funds, which were required urgently for the extensive repair of the synagogue in Linskill Street. And she was then describing in the letter the community as being very small, where once a flourishing community existed. By 1953, the synagogue still stood, but was disused. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. There was a chain of cinemas which thrived in the interwar years and after World War II, called the Isoldo. If you're of a certain age, you might remember them. This chain was founded by Sol Sheckman, Jewish man from North Shields. He bought his first cinema when he was 17. At its height, the chain comprised of 198 cinemas nationwide, and it was the third largest chain of cinemas in the country. Sol died in 1963. The Isoldo chain was bought out and swallowed up in 1972. The name Isoldo sounds so exotic, Spanish perhaps, was in fact made up of S for Esther, that's Sol's wife, Sol for Solly, and Do for their daughter, Dorothy Sheckman. As an aside, there is here a tenuous Leeds connection because Dorothy, the daughter of Sol Sheckman, went on to marry Maya Refson from Sunderland, whose brother Abel Refson, a motorcar dealer in Sunderland, was the father of the late Diane Yehuda Refson, head of the Leeds Beth Din, who of course very sadly died earlier this year. So there you have it. Let's continue with the Odyssey of the Latingas. All right, I've got a bit of a thing about the Latingas. Let's continue and see what happens. By 1861, Calmer Latinga had thrived in North Shields, having moved there from Sunderland. He was a merchant and shipbroker. He'd successfully expanded the Latinga business empire to the River Tyne from the River Wear. 4 of his children had been born in North Shields, but it was time for the Latingas, obviously, to expand their business to the River Tees. That's the most southerly of the 3 great east-west rivers of the northeast coast, which define its geography and its history. In the 1871 census, we find Calmer, that's spelled C-A-L-M-E-R, Calmer Latinga, living in Hartlepool, an important international port of the time between Sunderland and Middlesbrough. He was president of the Hartlepool community at one time. His wife had died, he was retired, he was 63, and his son Abraham had taken over day-to-day conduct of the shipbroking business. Abraham would live all his life in Hartlepool. He's buried in the Hartlepool Jewish Cemetery. He died at the age of 75 in 1921. Many of the founders of the small community of Hartlepool sailed from Hamburg and Memel in Lithuania, nowadays called Klaipėda, in ships owned by the Hartlepool Steam Navigation Company. And their original place of worship was in Old Hartlepool, the poorest area of town, near the port, as you might expect, in a room over a stable. There were, what is it with Jews and stables? Anyway, there it is. There were Jews worshipping in the town no later than the 1850s. In 1871, the community in Hartlepool had grown sufficiently to justify building a specially designed synagogue. It was opened in 1872 by Chief Rabbi Dr. Herman Adler. It was on quite a grand scale. There was seating for 150 and a schoolroom, cheder that is, to accommodate 80 children. Those Orthodox Jews who still lived in Old Hartlepool traveled to the synagogue by ferry, paying the fare of a halfpenny in advance of the Sabbath. In the Jewish Chronicle for the 20th of October, 1871, the secretary of the building committee for the Whitby Street Synagogue is named as, quote, Mr. A. Latinga. Now, Mr. A. Latinga was Calmer's son, Abraham Latinga, who'd been born in 1846 in Holland, arrived age 2 with his family at the port of Sunderland, moved to North Shields, then to Hartlepool. So Abraham Latinga's uncle, Asa Moses Latinga, founded and funded the first purpose-built synagogue in Sunderland. The family were in North Shields when the Linskill Street Synagogue was established. And now here was the nephew on a similar mission in Hartlepool. When you add to that the president of the Leazes Park Synagogue in Newcastle in 1899 was another son of Calmer Latinga, namely Moses Noah Latinga, and that the Latinga family or Latinga family members held high office in the Stockton and Darlington communities, you'll readily understand how influential this family was in the history of Northeast Jewry. Yet I don't recall the name Latinga being mentioned growing up in Sunderland. Is that because history is written from the writer's perspective? The large influx of Lithuanian immigrants from 1882 onwards meant that the history of the Northeast Jewish communities was written by Lithuanians who wrote from their own Litvak perspective, emphasizing their own undoubted achievements and perhaps being somewhat dismissive of the contributions of Jews from Holland and Germany who came before them, such as the Latingas. Hartlepool always struggled to sustain itself as a community, needing help from neighbouring large communities in Sunderland and Middlesbrough. Part-time ministers came and went. The community was served by a non-Jewish butcher who sold kosher meat under supervision. Burials took place at Sunderland Cemetery until the Hartlepool community had its own burial ground at Spion Cop. That's the same battle in the Boer War from which the Cop at Liverpool takes its name. The cemetery overlooks the sea and Holland in the distance. How appropriate, given that the Latingas are buried there. In its heyday, Hartlepool was a major port and shipbuilding town, and many of its Jews, like the Latingas, were ship's chandlers or ship brokers, and others travelled through the nearby pit villages with their backpacks, selling clothing, household goods on credit. Although by the time the Jubilee of the Synagogue was celebrated, that was in 1922, many, at least of the honorary officers, had moved up, as it were, the social scale, and they were jewelers or silversmiths. The community made its full contribution to local civic life. The brothers Ernest and Marcus Bloom both rose to be mayor of Hartlepool. Sol Levinson was a much respected local solicitor who served the community and indeed other communities in the Northeast for many, many years. At the time that the synagogue opened in West Hartlepool, the community had for a time a minister of its own. That was the Reverend Alexander Tertis. Interestingly, the Jewish Chronicle for the 28th of February 1975 carried an obituary for the minister's son, Lionel Tertis, born in Hartlepool in this little Jewish community in 1877, who went on to be an internationally renowned viola player. In 1955, 83 years after the Whitby Street Shul opened, there were 35 Jewish families or thereabouts in Hartlepool. 22 children were enrolled at the Cheder, built for 80, you'll remember. The Whitby Street Synagogue had fallen into disuse by 1967, at which time the congregation was too small to justify services even on the High Holy Days. And the synagogue was demolished about 1975. Again, I was in Whitby Street spying out the land last week, and I'm afraid there's nothing to see there anymore. The members of the community joined nearby larger surviving communities. Incidentally, and in passing, the acting and entertainment gene does seem to be carried by the Latinga family. The actor Blake Ritson is a direct descendant of Kalmar Latinga, himself the great uncle of the music hall entertainer who I mentioned, and film star Ernie Latinga. You may have seen Blake Ritson in The Bill, Casualty, Touch of Frost, the Emma BBC production, and Upstairs, Downstairs, and other things. His mother's maiden name actually was Latinga. I don't know if he acknowledges his Northeast Jewish heritage, but I hope he does. Hartlepool, of course, was a Jewish community, but it was also a transit point between the old world and the new world, a major point of entry from the 1880s onwards for poor immigrants from the Russian Empire. And the local press, non-Jewish press, described the at times ambivalent but kindly reaction of the local Jewish communities to the arrival of these hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of immigrants. One local newspaper reported about the new arrivals that, quote, The women had their heads wrapped in long wool shawls. The men were clad in thick and warm but mud-stained costumes. The clothing wasn't made for the wearers. Several small men had long, heavy coats, fitting where they touched and nowhere else. They looked anxious and dejected. When 200 Russian Jews arrived in June 1982, they were entertained to a substantial tea in the afternoon before being transported by train to Liverpool. Some were entertained at Whitby Street Synagogue. Others were given a substantial meal by Mrs. Samuels, God bless her, at the Commercial Hotel under the direction of local sympathizers. 200 refugees were given food provided by their Jewish compatriots from Sunderland and Hartlepool. In late May the same year, it was reported that so many Jewish people passed through the district that a subscription list had been opened towards defraying the expenses. Both Christians and Jews raised between £3,000 and £4,000. That's over £350,000 in today's values. Food and parcels of clothing were provided by the Mayoress of Sunderland, not a Jewish person, and distributed by the Reverend H.P. Levy of Sunderland. Some immigrants stayed in the town, Hartlepool. Others travelled to West Yorkshire, perhaps the most famous of those, Michael Marks of Marks and Spencer. Most, however, were on their way to New York via Glasgow or Liverpool, seeking their fortunes in the Goldener Medina, America. South Shields. South Shields lies directly across the River Tyne from North Shields, logically enough, and was a fishing port at the mouth of the Tyne, a few miles north of Sunderland. In the late 1880s, the heyday of the North Shields community, early Jewish settlers in South Shields used to travel by ferry boat across the river, quite a dangerous voyage in choppy water, to join the minyan on a Shabbat in the North Shields Synagogue in Linskill Street and to receive Jewish education for their children at the Cheder in North Shields. They would pay the fare for the ferry in advance of the Sabbath during a weekday so as not to desecrate the Sabbath, in an echo of the practice I described in Hartlepool. Aaron Simon Gompertz arrived in South Shields in 1846. He was followed later by Henry Cossack, Samuel Levy, Joseph Perlman, Lazarus Joseph, and their families. They formed the nucleus of the congregation. In 1878, the Jewish Chronicle reported that the South Shields Synagogue, it was in fact at that time a private house or hall, was crowded during the festivals. In 1885, Aaron Gompertz and Mr. Friedman Cohen were certified as secretaries for Jewish marriages in South Shields by the Chief Rabbi's office. And the first marriage took place at Sunny Terrace, South Shields, in 1892, a hall used as a makeshift synagogue. New members joined the congregation and decided to acquire larger premises for communal worship. The Jewish Yearbook of 1890 records that the Hebrew school consisted of 35 boys and 5 girls. The headmaster was the Reverend Bernard Lipkin, and the Reverend Lawrence of Sunderland was the visiting minister. Now, South Shields in Victorian times, it's not such a thriving place now, but in Victorian times, soon surpassed North Shields as the main port of entry to the Tyne River, exporting cargoes of iron and steel to the continent and coal down the coast to keep London warm. And the same ships that sailed to the Baltic returned with grain, textiles, and because it wasn't economic to return empty, they also carried human cargo to England at a very cheap price, a matter of pennies. So it was that Jews from the Baltic states, especially Lithuania with its port of Memel, settled in South Shields. Some of the Jews who'd settled earlier in North Shields later crossed the river to live south of the river in South Shields. By 1897, the Jewish population of South Shields had swelled to 100, and only a few years later it was 140. And the growing community then purchased number 38 Charlotte Square, which they converted into a synagogue. In 1909, the Jewish Chronicle reported that there was a Hanukkah service at the synagogue at that address, 38 Charlotte Street. Sweets and fruit were given to the children by the wife of the president, Mrs. Levy, assisted by her daughter Florence, all under the supervision of the Reverend Dr. Salis Dakes of Sunderland. As the congregation continues to grow in the 20th century, more accommodation at the new Victoria Hall in Fowler Street or at the Presbyterian Hall in Ingram Street was used for the High Holy Day services. A Chevra Kadisha was founded. Board of Guardians was founded. The president being Mr. J. Perlman, the treasurer being Mr. W. Sheckman. There was a branch of Chovevei Tzion also established. There was the Ladies' Benevolent Society. Just skipped. Let me just get the right slide. Yeah, and by 1917, a new and bigger synagogue was clearly in contemplation because there was a fundraiser held in the Victoria Hall, and in an obituary for Private Jack Perlman, son of Joseph Perlman, who'd been killed in action serving in East Africa towards the end of the First World War, there's mention of him, the son, being the honorary secretary of the new synagogue building fund and leaving a legacy for that purpose, the building of a new synagogue, in his will. The new synagogue was built and it was opened in the 1920s in Beach Road. I've put some pictures up. This is what it looks like today. And the community thrived in the interwar years, but waned as rapidly as it had grown, perhaps in a portent of things to come. In 1965, the synagogue in Beach Road suffered a burglary and all the silver ornaments, as it were stolen. Donations were raised for the purchase of replacements, principally donations coming from the Cossack family of Newcastle. And there was a service of rededication in 1967. Only 2 years later, in 1969, it was reported in the Jewish Chronicle that there was only 13 Jewish families left in the town, comprising some 50 people, although they still managed to get a minyan on Friday night and Saturday morning. The demise of one congregation, of course, often is the benefit of a neighboring community. So, for example, in 1965, Ivor and Lila Saville and their 3 sons left South Shields and moved to Sunderland, principally because Sunderland had a Jewish primary school. And it's right to say that South Shields' loss was Sunderland's gain because Ivor and Lila were very active in communal matters right up to the closing of the Ripe Road Synagogue in 2006. The community in South Shields soldiered on. The synagogue was still functioning as late as 1981. We know that because there was a wedding there between a bride from Sunderland and a groom from Dublin. Not entirely sure why they chose to get married in South Shields, but there it is. It was officiated over by Reverend Joseph Brownald, the minister at Sunderland, who I remember well. The synagogue closed its doors for the final time 13 years later. That was 1994. The building, as you can see from the photographs on the previous slide, still stands. It's in good condition. And I'm glad to report it's in daily use as a daycare center for children. The 2 tablets of the 10 Commandments carved in stone, still visible above the entrance to the building on the left-hand side, though I would expect very few of the locals know what it is. Darlington. Let's just take stock for a moment. Calma Latinga, 1848, joins his brother Asa Moses Latinga, who'd been the principal moving force in building the first synagogue in Sunderland. The family was active in North Shields. One of Calma's sons, Abraham, we've seen, had been instrumental in the building of the Whitby Street Synagogue in Hartlepool in 1871. Now, another of Calma's children, Sarah Latinga, married her first cousin, Jacob Schott, in 1866 in Hartlepool. Jacob's mother was Hester Latinga, the sister of Asa, Moses, and of Calma. So first cousins are marrying here. So Kalmar Latinger was both Jacob Schott's uncle and his father-in-law. Sarah and Jacob Schott lived in Sunderland, where their children were born, I think all of them. But in the census of 1891, they are found living in Darlington. 10 years later, 1901, they were living in Stockton-on-Tees, where Jacob Schott served as president of the synagogue for a time. Of course, although the name was Schott, his mother was a Latinger. So yet again, we've got the Latingers putting their stamp, as it were, on the communities, the small Jewish communities of the Northeast. It's right to say 10 years later, in 1911, Jacob and Sarah Schott had moved from Stockton to Middlesbrough, and that's where they're buried. You'll see from the 1891 census, which is on the screen at the moment, some evidence. If you look over to the right-hand side where I've highlighted, you can see some evidence that the practice of marrying first cousins, which wasn't uncommon in those days, nevertheless carried risk. Jacob and Sarah's son, Frederick, that's how he's recorded, aged 11, sadly is noted in the census to be, as they put it in those days, deaf and dumb. Let's look at Darlington and then Stockton, following, as it were, the trail blazed by this female branch of the Latinger family, Sarah and her husband, Jacob Schott. Both of them, as I say, Latingers by the female line. Few Jews, if any, lived in Darlington before 1884, in which a minion was formed by one Solomon Abrahams, meeting in the Livingston buildings in Northgate. Burials took place in the cemeteries belonging to the neighbouring communities of Middlesbrough and Stockton. After 1909, Jews were buried locally in a sectioned off portion of the municipal cemeteries. The cemetery is still very well kept. Some of the names of prominent members of the community evident from the headstones are Abrahams, Richmond, Raphael or Raphael, Solomon, Cohn, Kletz, Slivak, Meyer and Wilkes. The community found difficulty in renting suitable accommodation for worship. And though in 1904, a synagogue was opened at West End Buildings in Skinnergate in Darlington, between then and 1914, a period of 10 years, services were held actually in 3 different places, including in rooms above Burton the Taylors. Between 1904 and 1912, the Jewish population, just to give you an idea of the size of the place, about 80 or 90 Jewish people. 1930 was a turning point. Studley House in Victoria Road was converted to serve as a synagogue. The community took a full part in charitable work and civil society in the Darlington area. So, for example, we find in 1941, Councillor Barnett Jackson was elected mayor of Darlington. He'd been in business in the town for some 20 years, and he was on the council, the town council, for 11. It's recorded that in 1943, during the war, Miriam Berman, the daughter of Max Berman of Sunderland, who was, I think, temporarily living in Barnard Castle, made famous recently, of course, married Nathan Raymond of Birmingham at the synagogue in Darlington. 1945, just after the end of the war, Roy Rubenstein celebrated his bar mitzvah at the synagogue. That was the 1st of October. Last year, so I'm talking about 2019, Ian Rubenstein, I'm assuming that he is some relative of the bar mitzvah boy, now living in Calgary, Alberta in Canada, formerly of Darlington, provided to JCR UK, genealogists will know what that is, provided this photograph of the inscribed Kiddush cup presented to his maternal grandfather on the occasion of his grandfather, the Reverend B. Hyam's retirement as minister of the congregation in Darlington, which he served between 1914 and 1931. Now, one of the more colourful local Jewish characters was the Liberal MP for Darlington in the interwar years. He was called Ignaz Trebitsch Lincoln, although he was born Abraham Schwartz. He was a Jewish immigrant from Hungary, the son, it was said, of a rabbi. He fell under the influence of a Christian missionary society and took up their cause of saving Jews for Jesus. He next became a Church of England priest. He then gave up the cloth entirely and entered politics, sponsored by the Quaker families, in particular the Rowntrees. Yeah, those Rowntrees, who had always been, I've gone and skipped a slide again. Hold on a moment. Yeah. Hold on. Yeah. Back to him. The Rowntrees, who'd always been influential in Darlington. But this character, Trebitch Lincoln, obviously tired of politics because he returned to religion, but this time as a Buddhist monk in China, and he was calling himself Chow Kung. Now, my research suggests that he was actually a convicted con artist and at one time a Nazi collaborator. He died apparently in Shanghai in 1943 at the age of 64. I'm bound to say I don't have the impression that he was a regular synagogue attender. Nevertheless, it's an interesting story. Back to Darlington. Many Jewish refugees arrived in Darlington during and after the Second World War. They were viewed with a degree of suspicion by the more established, by now anglicised members of the community, but they made their full contribution, many of them setting up businesses in the nearby development town of Newton Aycliffe. In 1950, the Jewish Chronicle reported the death of Leah Rosenberg, former president of the Ladies Guild in Darlington, who during the war had hosted many Jewish servicemen who were stationed at the nearby Catterick Army Camp. So hospitality clearly was a top priority. In 1951, the Reverend M.I. Fabritz had resigned as minister in South Shields and taken up an appointment as minister of the Darlington Synagogue. One can only assume he saw that as a promotion. In May 1956, David Baum celebrated his bar mitzvah at the synagogue, and the following year, it was the turn of Ivor Martin. 1961, there was a B'nai B'rith reception for the small communities of Stockton, West Hartlepool, Bishop Auckland, Barncastle, Darlington, and the afternoon service was conducted by Dr. Lionel Kopolowitz, who was, of course, president of the Board of Deputies and hailed from Newcastle. 1967, a new synagogue in Bloomfield Road was opened by the president, Fred Ratchkind, in the presence of Chief Rabbi Israel Brody. So here on this slide on the left, we've got the Victoria Road Synagogue, and on the right at the top, we've got the original synagogue, the new one opened in 1967. And at the bottom, we have what was originally the caretaker's house. And I'll say a little bit about that in just a moment. There were never more than 30 or 35 Jewish families in Darlington in its heyday. It conducted itself, I'm told, like a single family. It couldn't really afford to be too inward looking. So it was very engaged with its non-Jewish neighbors. In 1974, 200 non-Jewish children were welcomed to the synagogue by the minister, the Reverend W. Wolfson. 1979, the Rabbi Albie Copeland was the communal rabbi, the last Orthodox rabbi to hold that post. 1981, Mrs. Rosetta Wilkes left money in her will for the Darlington Synagogue, which was obviously still operating, and for the old age home in Sunderland. But in the late 70s, early 80s, the community dwindled as young people moved away and weren't replaced. An old story with these small communities. Now, no Orthodox community exists today in Darlington, but in a way, it is a bit of an imposter as far as this talk is concerned, because it's not actually a dead community. There is a Reform congregation whose members keep the flame of Jewish tradition alive in the town. In 2007, the congregation moved from 15, the big building in Bloomfield Road, to number 13, Bloomfield Road, next door, more compact premises, which had been actually not the caretaker's bungalow, as I said earlier, it was the rabbi's bungalow on that previous slide that I showed you. And it's still there. I can tell you, I was there the other night taking photographs, these photographs that I showed you. The Darlington Hebrew Congregation, the DHC website, informs us that the community is a proud Reformed Jewish congregation. Members and visitors originally come from all Jewish denominations and can find their spiritual home at the DHC Reform Synagogue. And the DHC does educational and outreach work in the locality, inviting schools and other organizations into the synagogue. We can see some pictures here to learn about Jewish history and traditions. Jacob Schott and his wife Sarah Latinga had moved on from Darlington, as I said, to Stockton, definitely by 1901, but actually no later than 1895, because I think one of their children was married in Stockton in that year. The move from Darlington to Stockton, if you have a look at this census here, the move from Darlington to Stockton seems at first blush to have had devastating consequences for the deaf and dumb 11-year-old Frederick, who we saw in an earlier census in Darlington, because 10 years later in Stockton, he is recorded in the census as a female aged 21, and Frederick has turned into Florence. Anyway, this demonstrates, it seems to me, that while census records are invaluable to family historians, they are only as accurate as those who supply the information, and only as reliable as the enumerators who went from door to door gathering the details. Stockton-on-Tees, it's 4 miles to the west of Middlesbrough and about 12 miles from Darlington. Stockton was a very important market town and an important port in the early part of the 20th century. Stockton-on-Tees Jewish community was unusual in 2 ways. Firstly, the first Jewish families in Stockton-on-Tees were mostly British born. They weren't immigrants. Secondly, in 1906, when the synagogue in Stockton opened, it did so free of debt, without a mortgage, and that's fairly unique in these communities. Usually they were paying off the mortgage for years afterwards. Jewish communal activity in Stockton dates from the 1870s. How do we know that? Well, in a local newspaper from 1875 appears the rather curious headline, quote, "Slaughter of the first bullock for the use of the Jewish people in Stockton." I'd like to think they were going to eat it. It was reported that on Wednesday, the first bullock for the use of the Jews in Stockton was slaughtered by the Reverend J. Marks, the newly appointed rabbi, assisted by Mr. L. Crotch and Mr. L. Fryer, who was apparently a butcher, in whose premises the slaughtering was performed. And we also learned that the Reverend Marks was not only the local minister, but also the shochet, and he made his living selling Dutch clocks and old clothes. Certainly a congregation was established and a cemetery opened in Stockton no later than 1884. At first, services were conducted by lay people in private houses and later in a tavern, in a pub called the Crow's Nest. One of the earliest settlers was a Mr. Isaac Alston, who later emigrated, as I'll tell you in a moment. A pawnbroker at the time. He did migrate. He left Middlesbrough fairly early on and went to live in Melbourne in Australia. At one time, he'd been rebuked by the Synagogue Council of Middlesbrough for what were apparently his reform tendencies. And this may well have been the catalyst for him and some of his friends relocating along the River Tees to Stockton, where they then formed the core of the Stockton Jewish community. In 1884, there was a cheder with 11 boys, 3 girls, and the minister in charge was the Reverend Benjamin Cohn, who'd been trained at Jews College. It was that kind of community, very anglicized, and he served the community for at least 30 years. As I say, Isaac Alston emigrated to Australia as early as 1888, in fact, but in a ceremony in 1888, upon his departure, he donated a Torah scroll and an ornamental cover for it to the up-and-coming congregation. In 1895, Sarah Latinger and Jacob Schott's daughter, Caroline, was married in Stockton to Aaron Solomon Golston, a son of Eli or Ellie Golston, a pawnbroker or moneylender, and his wife Rose. The couple, that's Caroline, the daughter of Sarah Latinger and Jacob Schott, and her husband, they emigrated to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Caroline died there and she's buried there in 1920. In 1906, the community built its first permanent synagogue. That's in Hartington Road. I took the pictures you see on the screen, I took last week. So that's what it looks like in 2020. So Hartington Road, it was opened by Chief Rabbi Herman Adler. It cost £1,000. That's £112,000 in today's money. Most of the funds, this is why they were mortgage free, came from the F.D. McCatter Fund. Some money was raised locally and the balance came from Samuel Spitzel of London, who left money in his will, specifically for the assistance of small Jewish communities nationally. And Stockton got its share. I suppose this was like applying for and winning lottery funding. In 1906, that obviously was a red letter year, as it were, because in that year, Joshua Golston, that's another son of Eli and Rose and a brother of Aaron Golston, the chap who emigrated to Pittsburgh, he became the first Jew to contest and win a seat for the Stockton Town Council. And he remained a councillor for 39 years, and he was the mayor between 1927 and 1929. There was never more than about 35 Jewish families in Stockton, truly a boutique community. The Bishop Street area of Stockton, by the River Tees, parallel to the River Tees, was the centre of Jewish commercial life in the late 19th and early 20th century. George and Emmanuel Grosskopf were clothiers and tailors. Abraham Hyams was a pawnbroker, later traded in house furnishings. Wilfred Levison was a general dealer. David Hyams was a gas mantle merchant. Now, the children of the founders tended towards white-collar professions, and notable amongst them, Clifford Cohen, who won a military cross for his bravery in World War II, practiced at the bar of England and Wales on the Northeastern Circuit, and later became a county court judge. Not bad for a Jewish boy. His brother, in fact, also became a judge, not here, but in Cyprus during the insurgency in the 1960s. The last minister at Stockton was the Reverend Armin Hofstadter, who left in 1951 to take up a post in Toronto. Why on earth would he leave Stockton to go to Toronto? There it is. Thereafter, the former minister of Darlington Congregation, the Reverend Fabritz, and the Reverend Bernard Kirsch of Middlesbrough served the Stockton community on a part-time basis. In 1956, the community celebrated its jubilee, at which time its president was Mr. Sigmund Hamburger. The treasurer was Louis Cohn and the secretary, Mr. H. Bloom. Numbers having declined sharply, the synagogue was closed in 1970, the remaining members mostly joining the Middlesbrough community. So things had come full circle in a sense. In 1972, the synagogue in Hartington Road was sold to the Church of the Nazarene. The Star of David remains visible, as you can see, on its facade, although its stained glass windows, which also had Jewish symbols in them, are long gone. The foundation stone, which I think we saw in a previous slide, remains. Some names on headstones in the Stockton Jewish Cemetery are Abraham, Barnard, Cohen, Galinsky, Garbett, Getz, Gilbert, Golston, Hart, Hyams, Jackson, Jacobs, Kinsbergen, Lerman, Levi and Levy, Myers, Noah, Raphael, Richardson, Wilkes, and Wolfe. And those are just those who are buried there, not those who lived their lives there. Durham is on the River Wear, 12 miles upstream from Sunderland and 15 miles to the south of Newcastle on the main Northeast Railway line. It's famous for its university, its Norman castle, and medieval cathedral. The area was surrounded by pit villages, being in the middle of the Durham coalfield. Many Jews living in Sunderland and Darlington, including my own grandfather, Isaac Gordon, built up credit rounds amongst the miners. The Jews sold their merchandise on credit, walking on foot with backpacks from door to door. And as the miners would get paid on a Friday, they had to be on the spot to collect their weekly payments before the miners spent their pennies on other things. Some of these Orthodox Jews, in order not to desecrate the Sabbath on Fridays in the winter, found it more convenient to live near these pit villages. And that really is how the community in Durham came into existence. In 1888, there was a Mr. B. Morris, arrived in Durham from Lithuania. I don't imagine that was his name in Lithuania. He brought over his brother Edward and his father Jacob. 1897, Edward brought over his nephew, Nachman Burke, as a bridegroom for his daughter. And the couple married 2 years later. Nachman then brought over his brother, Baruch, and the Burkes were a family of learned Talmudic scholars. Don't think for a moment that because they lived in Durham, they were assimilated. They were very from people. And they gave service to the community for many years. In 1891, a Mr. J. Morris led a deputation to Sunderland requesting the loan of a Torah scroll. It appears that the Durham Jews were regarded as a branch of the Sunderland community. In 1904, the Durham congregation actually asked to remain affiliated, but be a separate community to the Sunderland congregation. This request was refused. Perhaps Sunderland had had enough of splits in their own community. During the early years of the 20th century, the London Jewish Board of Guardians, against the background of rising anti-immigrant and anti-Jewish feeling in the capital, adopted a policy of dispersal and dispatched and funded the travel of a number of East European Jews to various provincial towns, including Durham. The Jewish community in Durham was now able to form a minyan, a prayer quorum, and set up a small place for communal worship in John Street. The president was Edward Morris, the treasurer S. Herman, the secretary was Mr. B. Morris. The population was now about 72 souls. It's about 15 families. There was no minister or shochet, but the parents were knowledgeable enough to be able to teach their children in the Cheder locally as required. The visiting minister was Dr. Samuel Dakes, the resident minister of Sunderland, who was succeeded by his brother, Dr. Salis Dakes. Actually, they'd come to Sunderland from Leeds. The principal families in Durham, they were the Bergsons, the Garsteins, Robinsons, Cannons, Garbutt's again, Bergs, Books, Hermans, Newmans, Morrises, Burkes, Cadens, Diamonds, and Cones. The principal occupations of the first generation of immigrants were, as you might expect, credit draper, furnisher, tailor, cobbler, moneylender. Of course, their children tended towards the professions, doctors, lawyers, and so on. In the early part of the century, a number of these families left for Newcastle. And in 1918, for example, the Cadens moved to Leeds. I don't know whether there are any descendants of the Cadens in my audience. I don't know. And the Durham community, not long established, began to disintegrate. And it wasn't possible to get a minyan, a quorum of 10 men, for communal prayer. In 1930, the synagogue was in debt to the bank, but it was rescued by funding from Mr. Isaac Cohen. It's continued for another 30 years, giving support to the many Jewish soldiers who were billeted near to Durham during the Second World War. But with the end of the war came the end of a short-lived communal revival. And the last services were held in the autumn of 1944. 1955, the synagogue closed its doors for the final time and it was sold. You may have seen in a previous slide I showed you. It's now, I think it's a private residence. Still there, looks very pretty. Half of the proceeds of sale of the shul went to the Northeast Home for Aged Jews in Sunderland, and the rest was shared between Jesmond Synagogue in Newcastle and the then newly established Menara School, primary school in Sunderland. So thank you very much. I went to that school as a little boy. That's not quite the end of the story, because Durham University JSOC has and continues to be very active in the town, holding Friday night Shabbat meals and other socials. Furthermore, rather like in Darlington, there is a group of liberal Jews that have formed a small congregation. They have a website, which their leader, Chava Fleming, where their leader, Chava Fleming, says this: "We wanted, quote, to reach out to the descendants of the Orthodox synagogues in Bishop Auckland, Stockton-on-Tees, Durham, West Hartlepool, Sunderland, and Middlesbrough, which closed as the collieries and shipping industries dwindled. Both Jewish people and their non-Jewish partners and children are equally welcome." Bishop Auckland. Bishop Auckland is a market town in the Weardale Valley, midway between Durham and Darlington. It's actually on the River Wear. It wasn't until the mid-1930s that a Jewish congregation was organized, and the story of the community is the story of the rise of Hitler in Germany and the persecution of the Jews. And the community had a uniquely German Jewish flavor. Mr. H.R. Rollman was first in, and as it turns out, last out. He came from Frankfurt to London in 1932, settled in Bishop Auckland sometime later in the decade, when the Jewish-owned German firm for which he worked at managerial level, the Alligator Leather Bag Company Limited, transferred its business to the St. Helens Trading Estate, which is on the outskirts of Bishop Auckland. Another firm, the West Auckland Clothing Company, founded by a Mr. Lewin, Leo Lewin, an Orthodox German Jew, soon also established a factory. And there was then a need for infrastructure to serve the expanding population of Jewish managers and employees. Mr. Lewin had brought over many Jewish employees from Breslau in Germany, his native city, and also employed Jewish workers from Leeds and London who had experience in the production of ladies' and gents' clothing. Services were held every Sabbath at the home of Mr. Leo Lewin, and then a hall was rented in the local library. Mr. Nussbaum, another Orthodox Jew from Germany who'd settled in Gateshead, conducted the first High Holy Day services, and thereafter they were held on a regular basis. Men from Sunderland and Newcastle were brought in when necessary to lead the services and to make up a minyan. Mr. Karma, Mr. Greenblatt, both from Breslau, were also knowledgeable enough to lead the services. Mr. Karma had studied in yeshiva in Germany and had been engaged to Mr. Lewin, that's the boss's niece. But the niece was arrested in Germany by the Nazis and taken to a concentration camp. So he never married her, and indeed she was never heard from again, an atrocity repeated 6 million times over. Another visiting minister to the Bishop Auckland community was the Reverend Evans from Hartlepool, who held Cheder classes twice a week for the children of the community. Communal leaders included Mr. A. Freed, Mr. N. Gatoff, Mr. W. Muscat, and Mr. B. Perlman. They were the president, vice president, treasurer, and honorary secretary, respectively. The flowering of the Bishop Auckland community was brief. And by 1952, only Mr. and Mrs. Rollman were left, and ultimately they moved to Darlington, where they're buried. There is a separated section of the local cemetery in Bishop Auckland, established in 1946, which contains 13 Jewish burials. They're dated between 1952 and 2005. So curiously, actually, most of the burials post-date the end of the active Jewish community, which is curious. Family names of the community, in addition to those I've mentioned, were Mendoza, Hammerschlag, Benstock, Vogel, Diamond, Goldstein, and Palmer. Whitley Bay. It's a seaside resort at the mouth of the Tyne, 10 miles east of Newcastle and adjacent to North Shields and Tynemouth. There were Jews living there early in the 20th century. But it was in 1922 when the first regular services were held in a room above a shop in Whitley Road and later in a room on South Parade. The founder was a man called Jack Lukes, and the founding families were the Seegers, Josephs, Kaplans, Traegers, Bernards, Morrises, Lurys, and Rosses. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing any of those surnames. Reverend Nemeth of Gateshead was engaged as a full-time minister. When the community struggled to get a minion, young men would be drafted in from Gateshead, staying over the Sabbath with local families and travelling home only when the Sabbath concluded and travel was again permitted. The community gave precedence to a cheder over a synagogue building. Reverend Zucker succeeded the Reverend Nemeth and stayed until 1937. In 1939, a house was bought at number 2 Oxford Street. You can see where it is on this Google Earth diagram. 2 Oxford Street, there's a few rows, as you can see, back from the seaside. So this was another northeast community with a whiff of the sea air in its nostrils and the squawking of seagulls overhead. When the fish was fried for the high holy days, it might only be that morning that it had come off a local fishing boat. The Whitley Bay Synagogue was consecrated by Chief Rabbi Hertz, he of the Chumash, on the 21st of September 1938, assisted by the minister of the congregation, Rabbi Wengroff. It still stands today, a stone's throw from the seaside. Here it is. Although its previous life as a synagogue wouldn't, I think, be obvious to most passers-by. Again, I was there last week and can testify to the fact that it's still in use and still in good condition. Try to say the Second World War saw a swelling of the Jewish population due to the influx of evacuees and others seeking refuge from the industrialized cities of the Northeast, which were a magnet for the Luftwaffe. Jewish refugees arrived from Germany, many of whom set up businesses in the area, provided valuable employment. After World War II, some ex-servicemen put down roots in Whitley Bay, and the congregation continued to prosper, in spite of never really numbering more than 300 souls. It managed to employ full-time ministers, the Reverend Brish, the Reverend Balanoff, and the Reverend Greenberg. 1966, the community was still looking to the future, and the synagogue was renovated and reconsecrated by Rabbis Toporov and Rabbi Lerner of Newcastle, who will be well remembered. That was in the presence of civic dignitaries, as one would expect. The late 1960s, though, saw a sharp decline in membership. The community was able to function only due to the high quality of its knowledgeable lay leadership, Mr. Potash, Dr. Epstein, Mr. Gould, amongst others. In 1972, the community celebrated its jubilee, 50 years since the synagogue was built or consecrated, and still 50 families were left. Rabbi Hurling from Glasgow was appointed as minister. There was a brief revival. The synagogue and cheder was still active. There was a ladies' guild, Chevra Kadisha, Burial Society, and a cemetery of its own. The community was flagging, though, and by 1989, there were only about 20 Jewish people in Whitley Bay, and the synagogue closed its doors in 1992. But this is a nice story. The Jewish Chronicle for the 4th of December, I found 1998. It was reported, touching tribute to the community, that one of the Torah scrolls from Whitley Bay had been sent to Honduras as part of an aid consignment following the collapse of a synagogue in the Honduran capital, following, I think it was Hurricane Mitch. When members of the community heard about the loss of one of that synagogue's Torah scrolls, it was buried alive, basically, the Torah scroll, they donated one of their own now unused Torah scrolls, also Hebrew prayer books, prayer shawls, talesim, a wooden menorah, cheder items, and curtains. So you might say, in a sense, Whitley Bay hasn't died as a community, but lives on elsewhere, as is the case with many of these defunct Northeast communities. They live on, just not where they were originally located. In the case of Whitley Bay, a little piece of history can be found, its history can be found in the Caribbean next time you're on a cruise. To finish, here is a piece of trivia which may appeal to the rock music fans in the audience. One of Whitley Bay's attractions was the Seaside Fun Fair, known as the Spanish City. If you look at this slide, the Spanish City is in the box over to the right. You can see how close it was to the Shul, which is in the box on the left-hand side. So the Spanish City, they can't be separated. These are two together. The Spanish City, as I say, really, I mean, it's less than 5 minutes walk from one to the other. The Spanish City features in the lyrics of the Dire Straits song, Tunnel of Love. You knew that, didn't you? And here comes the obscure Northeast Jewish connection. The lead guitarist of Dire Straits was, of course, Mark Knopfler, who I think he was born in Scotland, but he was brought up in Newcastle. He went to Gosforth Grammar School in the heart of the Newcastle Jewish community. His father was a Hungarian Jewish refugee, and certainly in 1978, his mother, Louise Knopfler, was appointed the headmistress of the Jewish primary school, which then existed in Newcastle. So, ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. When it comes to a charity quiz or a pub quiz, it may be either, you'll know the answer to that particular question. What's the connection between the Shul at number 2 Oxford Street, the Whitley Bay Jewish community, and Dire Straits? Ladies and gentlemen, that is my talk. And really, thank you very much for zooming in, listening to the talk. If you're not already aware, there's a Northeast Jewish Expats Facebook group. There's a Sunderland Jewish Facebook group for those with former, with connections with the Northeast generally, or the Sunderland community specifically. It's enough if you are a descendant. So have a look and join up. And you can see here that I'm indebted to a number of sources for allowing me to do my research and give this talk. Thank you very much indeed, ladies and gentlemen.
David, thank you so much. That really has been brilliant. Quite a spellbinding account, and you really have a gift in bringing the past to life. I hope everybody's been looking at the chat. There have been numerous anecdotes and connections people have been posting, and we are recording the chat, so that will be sent to you. That will be sent to you. I don't know if you can see me. I think I've got a problem with my camera. Is that better?
I don't think we can see you, Jonathan.
Something very strange has happened, and I can't turn my camera on. So you'll just have to listen to me. Hang on a second. Oh dear me! No, it's not going to work. We've had a few questions, more around if there are people that you know. David Flasher says there was an Aubrey Gordon family in Hull. Was this your dad, or is there no connection there?
No, no connection actually. We used to get his post. That was the name of my father.
Okay, we've had some very interesting comments from Gordon Franks about donations from the Brighton Hebrew congregation in 1862, 2 guineas to North Shields to assist the poor family of the late Mark Moses, who lost his life by an accident on the railway, and further funding for the a burial ground in Hartlepool, and also a synagogue. So interesting that the Brighton community were helping to fund these congregations in the Northeast. And let's end with a question from Linda Rosen. She said, were there any Jews in Durham pre the expulsion of 1290?
Oh, well, I think the answer to that is I can't remember that far. No, I don't know, to be honest. But I dare say, because, you know, it was a major centre, really, I think there were Jews really anywhere where the court, the royal court, might have resided from time to time. They would go on tour. And I think...
Yeah, you can see me now, I fixed it.
Lincoln and Oxford and Durham, York, you know, there were Jewish communities. So I think the answer is probably.
That is absolutely fascinating. We have a gift. The Historical Society have got you a gift, which is a copy of Derek Fraser's excellent book, Leeds and its Jewish Community. So you can learn a little bit about things closer to home. It really is a fascinating book. And we'll get that to you in the coming days.
The video is on now, by the way.
Yeah, yes, I don't quite know how I fixed it, but my screen split in half, and for some reason the camera switches off. Don't know why. Anyway, Milim events continue this Wednesday. We have Paul Ulster, an ex-Leeds boy. Some of the audience may remember. He now lives in Israel, and he's recently published his debut novel, Kin or Country. It's a thriller set in Israel in 2048. Promises to be well worth signing up for. On Sunday the 13th, we are guests of the British Library for a digital walkthrough of their latest exhibition, Hebrew Manuscripts, Journeys of the Written Word, with its curator, Ilana Tahan. And this includes some fascinating documents, some of which have never previously been on public view. We continue on Wednesday, the 22nd of September, with another debut novel. Amanda Weinberg will be speaking about her book, The Tears of Monterini, a fictional account of true events during the fascist reign of Mussolini. On 30th of September, Ruth Diane Wolfner, who is Israel's leading divorce lawyer, is our guest. Her latest book is called The Karma Effect. And finally, for now, on the 12th of October, we are back with the Historical Society for a talk on Josiah Wedgwood and his response to the fate of the Jews. For more information or to book, please visit milim.org.uk. As I said earlier, you can also make a small donation there, which will help support our work and allow us to continue to provide these webinars. It remains for me to thank our speaker, David Gordon, once again. Looking forward to seeing you all at a future event. And until then, stay safe. See you soon.